Welcome back to our continued discussion of metabolism and energy balance. And this is the final presentation on this concept, where we consider body temperature as a component of energy balance. So we recall that body temperature is related to the energy balance in the body. So the energy output is either as work or as heat that can either be unregulated or regulated through thermoregulation. So we recognize certainly that energy input is related to diet, so hunger and appetite, satiety, and social and psychological factors contribute to that. So this reminds us that a calorie is a unit of measurement for heat generation, and it is possible to think of heat as a form of energy, and it's only technically that we measure all of the energy as heat. In biological systems, heat is more or less a byproduct of inefficient systems that perform work. So approximately 50% efficiency is what can be expected. And of course, of the 50% inefficiency of our work system that generates heat, we can regulate, and of course that is a critical exploitation of the nature of the biological system for organisms that can control or regulate their own body temperature. So the work portion, of course, is the transport across membranes. So we've seen a lot of ATP-dependent transport mechanisms. So that's what we're thinking about here. And we've always said that if energy is not available, if the ATP levels drop, then these transport processes will decrease and terminate. And this is critical for organs such as the kidney, where transport is very, very prominent process ongoing every instant that we are alive. And so compromise can lead to a shutdown of the organ or the organ system. So this is a very important feature of biological processes that we must always keep in mind, and a significant proportion of this 50% goes to that. And then of course the mechanical work is movement, and here we certainly think of the skeletal muscle is a big part of that, but the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. So there's a lot of things that are being moved, even movement within the cells of transport and secretion. The chemical work, so the synthesis for growth and maintenance, and then the energy storage, so high energy phosphate bonds are generated, the ATP, as well as phosphocreatine for skeletal muscle. And then chemical bonds such as the glycogen and the fat. So many of the enzymatic steps are ATP dependent in many of the metabolic pathways, synthesis and growth and maintenance, as well as the storage of energy forms. So some energy is consumed to achieve these endpoints. But all of these, to some degree or other, are not completely efficient, some more than others, but it is beyond our scope to try to differentiate those. But collectively, they are only 50% efficient, and 50% of the caloric input goes to heat. So then we really need to think about the external heat input beyond the caloric input as contributing to the internal heat production from the caloric content, right? So we burn calories when we exercise, and part of that, a byproduct of that is the generation of heat, is a way to think about it. But just in general, we are producing internal heat, and this can fluctuate, as you know, depending upon the level of activity mostly. But what we're thinking about is at any one point in time, the amount of heat that you're producing, whether you're just sitting still on a cool afternoon, or working really hard using all your muscles, climbing hills and moving stones or doing whatever, tremendous muscle effort in 100-degree temperature. So, what are you producing internally? You add to that coming in from the environment, and then you have to have that equaling the heat loss in order to stay at a regular body temperature. So this might vary a little bit, because we might have a net gain of heat sometimes, but it has to be rather small, less than just a degree or so. So the forms of heat input are radiant, conduction, and then the heat production internally is indicated here from metabolism and from muscle contraction. So they are contributing to the heat production, and we're focusing all on body heat, so the core body temperature is the way that we typically think about it. And so there's these two ways that heat can come into the organism. So, for example, you're sitting under a heat lamp, or if you've been on the Riverwalk, when it's cold out and they have the little propane or butane, whatever they are, heating devices working there, you feel that radiant heat coming at you. And then, of course, if you put your hands on a warm cup of coffee or tea and soak up the heat that way, then that's through the conduction. So we can gain heat from the external environment through radiation and conduction. And as well, we can radiate. I don't know if you've ever seen like the professional athletes, especially like a hockey player, they'll take off their helmet and you can actually see you can't see the radiation, but anyway, if you have special glasses for the infrared, you can see the radiant heat, but you can see the conduction and the convection even for guys like that. You can't really see the conduction, but you can see the convection. It's the perspiration that we haven't added here that will contribute to these two processes. So to come back to the internal source, from the metabolism, there's waste heat, there's non-shivering thermogenesis, about which we don't know everything. We know some things from animal studies and human developmental studies, and the authors cover this topic quite nicely in the textbook. And then there is shivering thermogenesis, and as well there's waste heat related to the muscle contraction. So our ongoing metabolic processes are not completely efficient, so there is waste heat. That's what this term is referring to. At any one point in time, there's some degree of tone in all of our muscles, and they are not completely efficient as we perform voluntary muscle contractions. Equivalent increases in waste heat will be generated. And of course, when core body temperature falls below a certain set point, then shivering thermogenesis is driven through the nervous system. So these two here, the non-shivering thermogenesis and the shivering thermogenesis, are the regulated processes for temperature homeostasis. And of course, as we know, there can be voluntary behavioral changes that originate at the conscious level, the cerebral cortex, but it's the lower centers from the hypothalamus and the limbic system that are contributing to the generation of that idea, like, hey, maybe I should go sit in the shade for a while and fan myself, right? Or go inside and sit next to the heater to thaw out. So continuing then, we think of some of the thermoregulatory reflexes. So if there's a change in the environmental temperature, certainly our peripheral thermoreceptors pick this information up. And if there's a change in the core body temperature, then there are central thermoreceptors, usually from the blood flow through the area in the brain, and they would be, these are, at least a set of these are located within the hypothalamus, but ultimately they all converge on the hypothalamic thermoregulatory center, and there can be responses to increased temperature or responses to decreased temperature, and of course they're balanced against each other at all times to maintain the range of body temperature. And we all know that the average for humans is 98.6, and that turns out to be 37 degrees Celsius. So the authors in the text describe the ranges and the pluses and minuses on either side and how they're considered in the context of hyperthermia, hypothermia, fever, and things like that. And I believe we have a couple slides on that as we proceed. So the thermoregulatory reflexes then to increase temperature would be sympathetic cholinergic neurons. So we typically think of the preganglionic, parasympathetic, and sympathetic neurons as cholinergic, but there is a subset, so there's an exception, and then the postganglionic sympathetics as noradinergic, and the postganglionic parasympathetics as cholinergic. So for the sympathetic postganglionics, there are some exceptions where they also are cholinergic, but they have distributions similar to the sympathetic nervous system. So therefore they are included in the sympathetic nervous system, and the location of the preganglionic neurons innervating the postganglionic cholinergics is within the thoracolumbar column of autonomic neurons, so they are included in the sympathetic nervous system. So anatomically they are sympathetic neurons based upon their anatomical location, but the neurotransmitter is still cholinergic in the postganglionic neurons. So they follow the vasculature, as do the postganglionic sympathetic fibers, out to the sweat glands and to the cutaneous blood vessels. And when these sympathetic pathways are activated, the acetylcholine is going to cause a vasodilation and the sweat secretion. So perspiration is dependent upon cholinergic signaling mediated through sympathetic neuronal innervation of the sweat glands. So the heat lost through evaporative cooling is what's going to occur there, and that's what I was saying is part of the convection-conduction system, but it's really categorized separately as the evaporative cooling. And I thought the authors did a very effective job in discussing this to interrelate it with the others, and I'll refer you to that so we can keep moving. So obviously with vasodilation, you're going to shunt the warmer blood to the surface, and therefore there's a shorter distance for the radiant and conductive and convective heat to escape from the organism. So the conductive heat loss is typically when you contact another liquid or solid, and there's a direct flow at that point of contact. And so you jump into a cool swimming pool, and certainly the radiant and convective forms of heat are going to quickly be converted mostly to the, they're not eliminated, but much of that heat being lost through those means when you're standing at the edge of the pool will suddenly be pulled off by conduction. So that's one way to think about it. So that's where I categorize the evaporative more as the convection and conduction. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. If we shunt blood to the surface, then heat will be lost. The responses to a decreased temperature, of course, are going to be the opposite. We're going to have sympathetic adrenergic neurons that follow the same pathways to the same target cutaneous blood vessels, and when they are selectively activated by the reflex systems descending pretty much from the hypothalamus down through the spinal cord to the preganglionics in the thoracolumbar intermediolateral gray column, and then on out to the postganglionics, and those postganglionic fibers follow the blood vessels out to the target areas. And this case, we get the selective activation of the sympathetic ones. We would not recruit the cholinergics. We would recruit the adrenergic sympathetic postganglionics, innervating essentially the same vascular beds. And we trigger a vasoconstriction where we're going to prevent any blood or most of the blood from circulating through the more superficial vessels in the subcutaneous tissue and in the dermis. And so the heat will stay in the core of the body. Now, as the external temperature gets lower and lower, and there's a greater risk of cutaneous heat loss, you even will get further constriction of some of the larger distributive vessels to the, it goes from distal to proximal, so you know that most people get frostbite and they lose their fingertips and the tips of their toes, the tip of the nose, and things like that. So it's the same way of thinking about the vasoconstriction. You're going to get the smallest vessels shunting from cutaneous to deep, and then the deeper vessels are going to start to constrict to preserve the core body temperature for the critical visceral organs. You can shed fingers and toes, but you can't lose your heart or your kidney or your liver or your brain. So that's the way that it works. In humans, it's not quite so certain where our brown fat may be located in adulthood, but certainly at birth, in the neonatal time period, there's a brown fat pad between the scapula and the interscapular space that is very important for thermogenesis, the non-shivering thermogenesis that occurs, and it's mostly from uncoupling of the electron transport system in the mitochondria, where rather than generating mostly ATP, you shift to a less efficient system, and less ATP will be generated and more heat will be generated. So this still exists in adults, and we just don't understand exactly where it's occurring and exactly how it happens. But of course it's contributing to the metabolic heat production, and it is part of the regulated system through the thermoregulatory reflexes. And then the somatic motor neurons, the skeletal muscles, the shivering thermogenesis, as we know, if you've ever started shivering out of control, you know that it helps to produce some heat. So the reflexes are vascular and related to either generating heat that will be retained, or creating an enhanced means by which you can exploit the loss of heat through the evaporative cooling. So the mechanisms of body temperature regulation are considered or summarized on this slide. So the neural control of the cutaneous blood flow alters the heat loss through the skin. The skin has obviously a very large surface area. The sweat contributes to the heat loss, and then the heat production comes from the voluntary muscle contraction and normal metabolism, and the regulated heat production, the shivering versus the non-shivering thermogenesis, as we saw. Let's consider then the homeostatic responses to a high external or environmental temperature. There will be measures taken to maximize heat loss. So you'll have the vasodilation, as we saw, to the cholinergic postganglionic sympathetic neurons and their fibers, an increase in the sweat gland activity, behavioral responses. You might use a fan to increase the convective heat loss, immersion in water to increase the conductive heat loss, as I said, staying out of the sun to prevent radiant heat going into the shade, or removing clothes to increase the net or the total heat loss through all of the systems. And we minimize heat production. There's a diminished food intake to lessen the obligatory heat production, and behavioral responses to decrease physical activity. In a low environmental temperature, the homeostatic response for the objective to minimize heat loss is that vasoconstriction of the cutaneous vessels, the lack of sweating. Behavioral responses would include adding layers of protective clothing, curling up to minimize exposed surfaces, and standing near a heat source to enhance the radiant heat gain. To maximize the heat production, shivering thermogenesis, non-shivering thermogenesis, which is lacking in evidence in humans, but just because it says it's unproved doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means we have not discovered how to disclose it yet and open it up for further and closer investigations, more systematic investigations. So when you have a very nicely located clump of brown fat, as in some of the animal models of rodents or in human neonates, you can perform some very nice studies. Not so many on human neonates, but within the limitations of what we can do with humans, you can do some work. But in adult humans, where we don't have a clump of brown fat, these are very difficult to investigate. So just because you see unproved doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The behavioral responses then would be the increased voluntary activity, so stamping of the feet or various things like that. The regulation of body temperature, then, we would think of our hypothalamic thermostat that can be reset. So there's a typical physiological range of variations that are within the normal range. Fever is actually included within this when the pyrogens reset the thermostat to a higher set point. So the authors make a very nice discussion about how in the past we had thought that fever up to a certain point, around in the low 100s, was still pathological. We now see it as a normal physiological response and part of the means of fighting off infections. But it still can become excessive and a bit out of control, and when it gets into the 101, 102, 103, and especially anywhere near I think the 106 Fahrenheit mentioned by the authors, then there's a threat to life. So it can cross over into pathological. But there still are some pathological cases of altered body temperature, such as hyperthermia. And these are more of a sustained increase on the higher range of typically the physiologically tolerable temperatures. But this is not so much from a reset of the thermostat as it is too much an imbalance in that equation we saw, too much coming from the external environment or too much being generated in addition to that, and the inability or an exhaustion of the system to dissipate a sufficient amount of heat. And people just not using their head to get out of the heat and take a break and hydrate themselves and things like that. So I'll refer you to the text to read the definitions of heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and how to differentiate those, and then certainly a malignant hyperthermia that goes a bit beyond just the external environment causing problems. Then the hypothermia, of course, is also covered very nicely by the authors in the text, and I'll refer you to that. It's a very interesting concept of how the clinical practice of recovering people that suffered hypothermia from an environmental exposure led to the discovery that the system could be exploited to improve surgical procedures and recoveries. So the summary of our chapter all together then was dealing with the appetite and satiety and getting to the energy balance, and we covered many topics in between. I'm not going to go through them all, as you know I typically don't. We considered the various pathways, anabolic, catabolic, absorption and utilization, and transport processes for many of the nutrients, good and bad, the homeostatic control, insulin glucagon being one of the prime examples. And now, of course, after this, we'll be talking about the endocrine impacts on metabolism, and we'll add other hormones, of course, to this concept of the endocrine impacts on homeostatic control of metabolism. And then also the regulation of body temperature to some degree as we continue on with that process. But very nicely we had this brief presentation on thermoregulation in the humans, and I appreciate your time and